When tech mogul Harrison Blake rushed home expecting to comfort his pregnant wife after losing their multi-million-dollar company, he found an empty house and a single note on the kitchen table. What he read next shattered everything he thought he knew about the woman he married 3 years ago. Harrison Blake had always believed he was living the American dream. At 34, he commanded a $1 billion tech empire from the 52nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, his name synonymous with innovation and success. His penthouse overlooked Central Park, his garage housed 3 luxury cars, and his bank account had more zeros than most people could count. But perhaps his greatest prize, in his mind, was his wife Serena. Serena Williams Blake was everything Harrison thought a successful man deserved. Intelligent, stunning, and accomplished in her own right as a software engineer, she had left her promising career at a major tech firm 3 years ago to support his growing business. At 29 and 7 months pregnant with their first child, she moved through their social circles with grace and dignity, even when the stares and whispered comments made it clear that some people questioned what a brilliant black woman was doing with Harrison. Harrison told himself he didn't see color, that their love transcended such petty concerns. He was proud to have a wife who turned heads at every tech conference and charity gala. What he failed to recognize was how often he failed to truly see her at all. The beginning of the end started at the annual Tech Forward conference in Miami. Harrison was presenting his latest innovation, a cloud computing platform that promised to revolutionize data storage, when he spotted Richard Whitmore in the audience. Whitmore was old money, the kind of billionaire who inherited his first $100 million and built his empire on connections rather than innovation. His venture capital firm had been one of Harrison's earliest investors, and his approval still meant everything in certain circles. After Harrison's presentation, Whitmore approached with his usual calculating smile. "Impressive as always, Blake. Though I have to say your wife certainly draws attention. Quite the exotic beauty you've got there." The word exotic made Harrison's stomach twist, but he managed a weak laugh. "Serena's brilliant. She actually helped develop some of the algorithms behind today's presentation." Whitmore's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement or contempt. "Of course she did. Must be nice having such diverse perspectives warming your bed and your boardroom." Harrison should have walked away. He should have defended his wife, should have told Whitmore that his comments were inappropriate and racist. Instead, he found himself laughing nervously and changing the subject to quarterly projections. It was easier than confrontation, easier than risking Whitmore's displeasure. That evening at the conference dinner, Whitmore's comments grew bolder. "You know, Blake, some of the board members have been talking, wondering if you're perhaps too distracted these days. A man needs focus to run an empire. Can't be worried about domestic complications." The domestic complications was clearly a reference to Serena, who sat at their table radiating quiet dignity while enduring the subtle hostility around her. Harrison noticed how the other wives seemed to form their own circle, how conversations died when Serena approached, how she spent most of the evening with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. But Harrison was too caught up in Whitmore's approval to see the pain his wife was enduring. When Whitmore suggested a private meeting the following week to discuss the future of Blake Industries, Harrison was thrilled. He went to bed that night thinking he was on the verge of his biggest breakthrough yet. The meeting took place in Whitmore's marble and mahogany office, where family portraits dating back to the Civil War watched from gilded frames. Harrison arrived expecting to discuss expansion plans. Instead, he found himself facing a hostile takeover. "I'm afraid the board has lost confidence in your leadership," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to destroying lives over lunch. "Too many distractions, too many questionable decisions. We're exercising our option to buy out your shares." Harrison's world tilted sideways. "You can't do this. It's my company. I built this from nothing." Whitmore's smile was sharp as a blade. "Actually, if you read the fine print on those investment contracts you signed so eagerly 5 years ago, you'll find we can do exactly this, especially when we have documented concerns about your judgment being compromised." The next 48 hours passed in a blur of legal battles, media speculation, and financial hemorrhaging. Harrison's lawyers told him there was little they could do. The contracts were ironclad, and Whitmore had been planning this for months. The media painted Harrison as an incompetent CEO who had let success go to his head. Worse, several articles made thinly veiled references to his controversial marriage and whether his personal life had affected his business judgment. By Thursday evening, Blake Industries was gone. The penthouse was mortgaged to the hilt. Their assets were frozen pending litigation, and Harrison's reputation was in ruins. He sat in their living room surrounded by the trappings of success that no longer belonged to him and felt the weight of failure crushing down on his shoulders. When Serena came home from her doctor's appointment, she found him there in the dark, still wearing the same clothes from 2 days earlier. She didn't say anything at first, just sat beside him and placed her hand on his arm. Her touch, once comforting, now felt like a reminder of everything he'd lost. Maybe Whitmore was right, Harrison said finally, the words bitter in his mouth. Maybe I was distracted. Maybe I should have listened when people said mixing business with personal complications was a mistake. He felt Serena's hand go still on his arm. When he looked at her, her face was carefully neutral, but something had changed in her eyes. Personal complications, she repeated quietly. You know what I mean. The media, the whispers, the way people look at us. Maybe it did affect my judgment. Maybe I lost focus because I was trying so hard to prove that we could work, that I could have both the empire and... He trailed off, but the damage was done. The words hung in the air between them like a poison that couldn't be taken back. Serena stood up slowly, one hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. And what, Harrison? Say it. But he couldn't say it, couldn't voice the ugly thoughts that had been planted in his mind by months of subtle racism and not-so-subtle disapproval. His silence was answer enough. I see, she said, her voice steady but distant. Well, I suppose that makes things clearer. She walked to their bedroom without another word, leaving Harrison alone with the weight of what he'd just revealed about himself. He tried to tell himself he didn't mean it, that he was just angry and looking for someone to blame. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. Some part of him had always wondered if his life might have been simpler, his path to success smoother, if he'd chosen someone who fit more easily into his world. The next morning, Serena was gone. Harrison woke to an empty bed and a silence that felt different from the usual quiet of their morning routine. He called her name as he walked through their apartment, but there was no answer. In the kitchen, he found her wedding ring sitting next to a folded piece of paper on the granite countertop. The note was brief. I'm sorry you feel I was holding you back. I've gone somewhere I can finally move forward. Take care of yourself, Harrison. S. That was it. No forwarding address, no contact information, no indication of where she might have gone or when she might return. Harrison's phone calls went straight to voicemail. When he called her sister in Chicago, the conversation was ice cold. She's somewhere safe, was all Carmen would tell him. Somewhere she won't be made to feel like she's somebody's mistake. The words hit him like a physical blow. He tried calling Serena's former colleagues, her college friends, anyone who might know where she'd gone. Most hung up when they heard his voice. The few who spoke to him made it clear what they thought of a man who would abandon his pregnant wife in her time of need. Abandon her? Harrison protested to one of Serena's former co-workers. She left me. After you told her she was the reason for your failure, came the sharp reply. Real nice, Harrison. Real classy. As the days turned into weeks, Harrison's desperation grew. He hired private investigators, checked hospital records, even filed a missing person report, though the police made it clear that a woman leaving her husband wasn't exactly their top priority. Every lead turned into a dead end. Serena had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. It was during one of his increasingly frantic searches through her belongings that Harrison discovered the laptop hidden in the back of her closet. It was an older model, nothing like the high-end machines they both used for work, and he almost overlooked it. but something made him power it on, hoping against hope that it might contain some clue to her whereabouts. What he found instead changed everything. The laptop was password protected, but Harrison knew his wife's habits well enough to guess her login credentials on the third try. What he discovered when the desktop loaded made him sink into the chair beside her vanity table, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The screen was filled with folders containing code unlike anything Harrison had ever seen. Complex algorithms that seemed to predict and adapt to user behavior, artificial intelligence subroutines that made his own company's innovations look like children's toys, and system architectures that could revolutionize everything from healthcare to space exploration. The metadata on the files showed creation dates going back 3 years, right around the time Serena had left her job to support his business. While he'd been building his empire on incremental improvements to existing technology, she'd been quietly developing the kind of breakthrough innovations that every tech company in the world was desperately trying to achieve. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. As Harrison dug deeper into the files, he found correspondence with various tech companies, all addressed to someone named S. Williams. The mysterious S. Williams who had been ghostwriting technical papers that were reshaping entire industries. The phantom genius whose work had been cited in dozens of patents and whose algorithms had been quietly integrated into systems used by millions of people worldwide. S. Williams, who every major tech company had been trying to identify and recruit for the past 2 years. S. Williams, whose revolutionary work on pregnancy-safe health monitoring systems had recently sparked a bidding war among Silicon Valley's biggest players. S. Williams was his wife. Harrison sat in that chair for hours, scrolling through project after project, each one more impressive than the last. Serena hadn't just been supporting his career, she'd been building her own empire in secret, developing innovations that made his billion-dollar company look like a lemonade stand. The final piece of the puzzle came when Harrison traced an IP address buried in the laptop's network logs. It led him to a small tech startup in Portland called Innovate Solutions. A quick search revealed that the company had recently been making headlines for its revolutionary AI-powered healthcare platform, developed by their mysterious lead engineer who preferred to work behind the scenes. Harrison was on a plane to Portland within 6 hours. The Innovate Solutions office was nothing like the gleaming corporate towers Harrison was used to. It occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse in Portland's Pearl District, with exposed brick walls, recycled furniture, and the kind of creative chaos that mark truly innovative companies. Harrison stood outside the building for nearly an hour, gathering the courage to go inside. When he finally climbed the stairs and pushed through the glass doors, he was greeted by a receptionist who looked like she might be fresh out of college. Her name tag read Jamie, and she studied Harrison with the kind of casual assessment that suggested she was used to dealing with people who thought money made them important. "I'm here to see S. Williams," Harrison said, trying to project the authority that had once commanded boardrooms. Jamie raised an eyebrow. "Do you have an appointment?" It's a personal matter. I'm her husband." The eyebrow climbed higher. "Her husband? Serena's married?" The casual use of his wife's real name hit Harrison like a punch to the gut. Here, in this converted warehouse among people who probably couldn't afford his old business suits, Serena was simply Serena, not an exotic decoration or a questionable choice, just a brilliant woman doing brilliant work. Jamie picked up her phone and spoke in low tones for several moments before hanging up. "She says you can go up to conference room B, third door on your left." Harrison climbed another flight of stairs, his heart pounding with each step. Through the glass walls of conference room B, he could see Serena sitting at the head of a long table, her pregnancy now advanced enough to be clearly visible even through her professional blazer. Around the table sat several people in expensive suits, their tablets and briefcases marking them as the kind of high-powered executives Harrison used to consider his peers. He paused outside the door, listening to fragments of the conversation inside, numbers being thrown around that made his head spin. 2.8 billion, exclusive licensing agreements, revolutionary healthcare applications. His wife, the woman he'd accused of being a distraction, was calmly negotiating deals that dwarfed anything he'd ever accomplished. When Harrison finally pushed open the door, the conversation stopped. Every head turned toward him, and he suddenly felt like the outsider he'd never believed himself to be. The executives looked at him with the kind of polite confusion reserved for people who'd wandered into the wrong meeting, but Serena's expression was unreadable. She looked at him for a long moment, then turned to the others at the table. "Gentlemen, could you give us a few minutes? We can resume shortly." The executives filed out, murmuring among themselves and shooting curious glances at Harrison. When the door closed behind them, he found himself alone with his wife for the first time in 6 weeks. Serena looked different, not just because of her advanced pregnancy, but because of something in her posture, her expression. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. It was attractive and heartbreaking at the same time. "You found me," she said simply. "It took a while." Harrison's voice cracked slightly. "I didn't know about all of this. S. Williams, the innovations, the companies fighting over your work." "No," Serena said, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. "You didn't know. You never asked. But why didn't you tell me? We're married. We're supposed to be partners." Serena was quiet for a long moment, studying her hands folded on the table. When she looked up, her eyes held a sadness that cut through Harrison more effectively than anger would have. "Because I learned early in our marriage that you saw me as an accessory to your success, not a contributor to it. When I tried to suggest improvements to your algorithms, you'd pat my head and tell me not to worry about the technical stuff. When I offered to help with presentations, you'd thank me and then ask me to focus on looking beautiful for the investors. You loved having a brilliant wife, Harrison, as long as my brilliance never overshadowed yours." The words hit him like physical blows, each one landing with the weight of truth he'd been refusing to see. "But you left your job to support my company. You said you wanted to help me build something. I left my job because I knew I could build something better on my own time without having to navigate the politics and prejudices of corporate America." Serena's voice was steady, matter of fact. "Do you know how many meetings I sat in where I was the only black person in the room? How many times I had to prove myself twice as hard for half the recognition? At least working alone, I only had to deal with your blindness, not everyone else's." Harrison felt the room spinning around him. "I defended you. I always defended you." "Did you?" Serena asked quietly. "Did you defend me when Richard Whitmore called me exotic? When he suggested I was a distraction? Or did you laugh along and try to change the subject?" Harrison's silence was answer enough. Serena nodded as if she'd expected as much. "I knew Whitmore was planning to take your company," she said. "I'd been tracking his moves for months, watching him position his pieces. I tried to warn you, but you told me not to worry about business matters, said it would stress the baby." "You knew?" Harrison's voice was barely above a whisper. "I knew your company was built on borrowed time and other people's tolerance. I knew that your success depended on appeasing men like Whitmore who saw me as a liability, so I prepared." She gestured toward the door where the executives had exited. "Those men weren't here to make me an offer, Harrison. They were here to finalize the acquisition of my patents by their respective companies. The bidding war ended this morning at $4.7 billion. Harrison's legs gave out and he sank into one of the conference room chairs. $4.7 billion. While he'd been building his empire on incremental improvements and investor relations, his wife had been quietly developing technology that was worth 5 times what he'd lost. "I don't understand," he said finally. "If you could do all this, if you're this brilliant, why did you marry me? Why did you stay as long as you did?" Serena's expression softened slightly. "Because I loved you. Because I believed that love could overcome the blindness and the casual cruelty. Because I hoped that someday you'd see me as more than a beautiful accessory or a risky choice." "I do see you," Harrison said desperately. "I see you now." "Do you? Or do you just see my bank account?" The question hung in the air between them, and Harrison realized he didn't know the answer. Was he here because he loved his wife or because he discovered she was worth more than he'd ever dreamed? The uncertainty on his own face seemed to be all the answer Serena needed. "The executives will be back soon," she said, standing up carefully. "I have deals to finalize and a future to secure for our child." "Our child," Harrison repeated. "I'm still the father." "Yes, you are. And I'll make sure our child knows their father, knows they're loved by both of us, but I won't raise them in a world where their mother is seen as a limitation rather than a strength." Harrison looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw perhaps for the first time the extraordinary woman he'd married. Not the exotic beauty or the risky choice or the domestic complication, but a brilliant innovator who had built an empire while invisible to everyone who should have been paying attention. "What if I changed?" he asked quietly. "What if I learned to see you, really see you?" Serena considered this for a long moment. "Then maybe we could start over. Not as the tech mogul and his trophy wife, but as two people building something together, as equals." The word equals hit Harrison like a revelation. In all his years of marriage, he'd never truly seen Serena as his equal. He'd seen her as his prize, his support system, his beautiful accessory, but never as his equal partner in building a life together. "I'd like that," he said, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything. "I'd like to try." Serena studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she could believe in. Finally, she nodded toward the door. "Those executives are offering me positions that would make me one of the most powerful women in tech, but I turned them all down." "Why?" "Because I'm building something better. A company that develops technology to help people, especially women and minorities who've been overlooked by the industry. I could use a good marketing director, someone who understands what it feels like to lose everything and start over." Harrison's throat tightened with emotion. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a chance to be part of something that matters. To help build a company based on innovation and inclusion rather than ego and exclusion. It won't make you a billionaire again, at least not right away, but it might make you the man I thought I married." Harrison looked at this woman who had loved him despite his blindness, who had built an empire in the shadows while he stumbled around in the spotlight, who was offering him a chance at redemption he didn't deserve. "What about Richard Whitmore? What about the people who said you were holding me back?" Serena's smile was small but genuine. "Let me worry about Richard Whitmore." 6 months later, Harrison Blake found himself in a modest Portland apartment, changing diapers at 3 in the morning while his wife conducted board meetings from the converted bedroom they used as her home office. Williams Technologies had grown from a startup to a major player in the tech industry, with Serena as CEO and Harrison running their marketing and community outreach programs. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was better than the one he'd lost. He was married to one of the most powerful women in technology, and this time he knew it. Their daughter, born healthy and beautiful, would grow up in a world where her mother was recognized as the genius she'd always been. The final twist came when Harrison received a phone call from Richard Whitmore's office. The man who had destroyed his first company was desperately trying to recruit S. Williams to develop technology for his portfolio companies. He had no idea that the brilliant innovator he was courting was the same exotic woman he'd dismissed as a distraction. Harrison smiled as he politely declined to provide contact information for his wife. Some people, he realized, would never learn to see beyond their own prejudices, but that blindness was their loss, not his anymore. As he hung up the phone and walked back to the nursery where Serena was singing softly to their daughter, Harrison reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He'd lost everything he thought mattered, only to discover that everything that actually mattered had been right beside him all along. The real tragedy wasn't that he'd failed to see his wife's brilliance. It was that so many others continued to make the same mistake, dismissing extraordinary people because they didn't fit into neat, comfortable categories. But their blindness was becoming increasingly expensive, and Harrison had a front-row seat to watch the world slowly learn what he'd learned too late. Never underestimate someone because of how they look, where they come from, or who they love. In the end, the most successful people aren't those who climb the highest. They're those who lift others up as they rise. And sometimes the biggest failure isn't losing everything you thought you wanted, it's failing to see the treasure that was right beside you all along.